When you're looking at these guns, you aren't comparing this number to this number. That's not what's happening. That's what it seems like on the surface, but it's not. In this talk, we're basically just going to be looking at some menus. We're going to break down a bunch of different little situations from the games that I've come across recently. We're going to talk a bunch about why they failed, what they were trying to achieve, and then we're going to look at an example of a good menu. I've prepared a bunch of little screens and slides and things here, which we'll go through. The first thing that I wanted to talk about was just what we're going to do in this talk really, really, really quickly. Welcome to the talk. How these menus miss the mark. We're basically going to break down some of the UI problems with the menus that the games had. In using these games, there were some frustrations or something that I found that was annoying to either use, or it arrested the gameplay or something like that. We'll break down what those are, we'll talk about them, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look at a really, really good example. It's all kind of around this idea of when you're in a menu and you're getting someone to look at two different things, that's doing a comparison. And what you want to do is you want to give the person that is doing that comparison as much information as possible so that they have to do as little mental work as possible. We're going to be talking about Borderlands 2 to begin with. We're in the middle of COVID at the moment. I guess it's not really the middle. In COVID at the moment, we've been in lockdown for a few months. I've been playing a bunch of Borderlands with one of my mates. Started playing the second game. Now, Borderlands is a very menu-heavy game. You are doing a lot of comparisons between gear. Outside of the core game loop of shooting stuff and killing enemies and doing quests, the next thing that you do the most of, and you do a lot of it, is compare gear to other gear, because it's a looter shooter, and therefore there's lots of gear that's popping up all over the place, and you want to maximize your capabilities within your loadout, and so you're doing a lot of gear comparisons back and forth between each other. That brings us to this first interface. If you're doing a lot of comparisons between gear back and forth, you really don't want to be doing math on 5 different stats. And that's where this particular interface here fails. So what's happened here is I've come up to a gun that I've found in something or other. It's a very common situation in Borderlands. And I'm now looking at this gun, and there's this little kind of in-world interface that allows me to compare its stats against the stat of the gun that I have equipped. This is the gun that's sitting in the box, obviously here, this square menu, and then this is the stats of the gun that I currently have equipped. And so what is it doing right? Well, it's at least partially doing a comparison between each of these stats for us, right? Which is good. So it's saying up, it's saying down, depending on what that is, and it's comparing it against these stats here. Each one of these things has a color code to it as well. So green for up, red for down. Let's keep in mind for this entire chat that most of the stuff that we're talking about is going to be red and green. Red and green are two of the colors that the most common type of color blindness have difficulty seeing. So for those people, the red and green will look like a different shade of brown, and so they'll look very similar, which is why it's important to have a discernible shape in this case, which is an up or a down arrow, so that you can tell which direction that's going without the need of the color, but the color makes it easier for most players. It's getting all of that right. Where this piece falls down is you might do this all the time. You're doing this constantly during the game. This says down, but not by how much. And this says up, which is obviously the comparison. So if that one's down, this one is up. But again, not by how much. And so where you fall into a problem here is you get to this piece of menu and you're like, okay, I want to know if each of these stats is better than this gun. What you end up having to do is you have to go, okay, for each stat, I need to work out how much difference this is. And so what this ends up being is sometimes you can very easily just glance at it and be like, yeah, no, that's not interesting to me at all. Quite often you'll see something that might be like down, down, up, and this damage will be maybe like 4,885, and this one is 4,999 by 2. So you then have to go, okay, this is how much less? So in this case, it's 500 less damage for 5% less accuracy. It fires slightly faster. And so you have to go through that process, and then you have to think about whether this is better than this. So how can we improve this UI piece. Essentially, you would just do the math for them, right? Each one of these you can sort of look at and work out exactly what the difference is. So it's 550 better in this, 4% better accuracy, it's 0.7% better reload speed. And so now we can, without having to look down here, we can just compare between these numbers, right? And so we can say, am I willing to take 550 extra for a worse reload speed, for 100 or 550 less, blah, blah, blah. And so that would be a much better way to do it. Actually do the comparison, show them the information, because that takes out the step of having to do that math on the fly and compare back and forth. Now, you might say to me, and understandably, you might say, well, that's not that hard. Just do the math. It's fine. Now, this gets worse when we get into this menu. When you then jump into this menu, you've got all of your guns. So you can see this is a sniper, and further down here, I actually have 2 more snipers. When you're comparing 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th gun, now when you're doing this math back and forth to be like, this is 10,000 and this one is 8,000, but it's slightly faster, but it gets much, much more complex to have to do the math every single time you're looking at the gun, flicking back and forth between multiple guns and doing the math again, when it can just be displayed next to the numbers kind of thing. And then taking this all back to what we said at the start, the core game loop for this game is shooting stuff, right? It's shooting stuff. The core game loop for this game is not comparing numbers against each other, right? There's no fun in comparing 2 different sets of numbers, right? There's even less fun in comparing 2 different sets of numbers, but having to do the math on every single set as well. And you're doing all of this math, and you're not even actually really comparing the guns. You're just spending a few seconds looking back and forth between these stats and trying to work out the numbers that you need to compare. Because when you're looking at these guns, and this is kind of the important thing to keep in mind across this entire thing, is when you're looking at these guns, you aren't comparing this number to this number. That's not what's happening. That's what it seems like on the surface, but it's not. What you're comparing is the difference between this number and this number. So what you're comparing is what you currently have equipped by what you could potentially have equipped. I don't care that this gun is 4,445, and we're going to talk about this in a second when we get to the good UI. But I don't care that this is 4,445. I only care if this number that comes out of this is bigger than this number. This number needs to get compared against each of the other sums that you do. That is the numbers that I'm suggesting should probably be here, which is the difference between the 2 things that are being compared. This is the only thing that matters. The only thing that matters between these 2 things is the fact that there's a difference between these 2 numbers. It doesn't matter what this is. If this was 6, if this was 27, if this was 4, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that 27 is better than 25 in relation to how much each of these are better or worse. Now, you might be saying, well, Borderlands 2 is a fucking old game. Why are we talking about that? Well, UI has come a long way in the last sort of probably 10 years, whenever Borderlands 2 came out. But let's have a look at this one. This is the Borderlands 3 UI. Now, it has definitely made some improvements in the sense that this is now coloured. The entire thing is coloured, so it's much, much easier to, at a glance, see that this stat is higher, this stat is higher, this stat is higher, this stat is higher, lower, this stat is lower, this stat is lower. Easy peasy. Obviously, that's going to be converse to what's currently equipped. But they're still missing that key piece of information, which is, what is the difference between these 2? What is the difference? That's what's important. How about a game that came out this year, like 12 years later, that has the exact same problem? How about that? All right, I got you. This is the Final Fantasy VII Remake UI for a store. This is a comparison of how much each stat is affected and what each stat will be if you were to equip this bracer. For most players, they aren't going to care that this is 79. Right? 79 is an irrelevant number. What people are going to actually care about is the relationship of each of these stats before and after. In this case, for the studded bracer, if Cloud was to equip it, he'll have 143 attack, 119 magic attack, he'll have 79 defense, and he'll have 42 magic defense. What does that mean? Well, it means nothing. It literally means nothing. What the comparison is here, whether this is a good option to buy, is whether or not this increase in 40 and 10 is worth it for whether or not, like, depending on how you're playing Cloud. It could be an increase of 2 and a decrease of 37. And in that situation, that's a shit buy because you're only getting 2 defense and you're losing 37 magic defense. That's really what you're comparing. You're comparing how much these are going up and down versus what they currently are, not the number that they will eventually be. Yes, at a glance, this is good because I can quickly look at this and be like, okay, this is down, this is down, this is down. Oh, but this is a straight increase in defense and attack, and I'm not losing anything for it. So in theory, that's a good buy. It's only a benefit. But every other character, I now need to do extra math somewhere else to work out whether or not this increase is worth this decrease. We're not actually getting displayed the information that we need in order to make a purchase here, which means that the player then has to go and do that math themselves, which again keeps them from doing what we want them to do, which is the core game loop. And you end up in the same situation that you do in Borderlands 12 years later, the exact same freaking problem, where the thing that you're comparing and the stat doesn't matter. The only matter is the difference. You're not being shown the difference, and so instead, you're working out and trying to mentally track these differences the entire time in your head to work out whether or not you should be making this purchase, right? Here's the worst part, the very shittest part about this whole situation with Final Fantasy, right? Let's say you make a purchase here. You go to equip it in the menu. You ready? You ready for this one? You go in. This is a talisman. It's a different thing. I understand. You go in. You're like, I'm going to equip this. They're already doing it. In the game is exactly what we were just fucking talking about, and they understand that it needs to be in there and it's a valuable thing to have in there. It's in the game. So they understand that this shit's important. It's just not in the fucking UI. And my guess is that's just because this UI is already pretty cluttered. And so the form of this UI has taken preference over the function of this UI. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is this is something that you've only mentioned in regards to inventories. It seems to be that you're just nitpicking on something specific. Let's talk about another situation. Now, this is a mock-up. I very quickly put this together just before the talk, but I'm sure you guys have all come across this. Again, what we're doing is we're doing a comparison, right? Anytime where we're making a purchase or we're looking at two things or we're having to make a decision, we're doing a comparison. It's a comparison, whether that's on value, whether that's on time, whether that's on something. It's a comparison, right? And so the most effective way that we can display that comparison is by basically just putting the exact thing that you're comparing next to the thing that you're comparing it against. That's the easiest way we can do it. And that is where these numbers here succeed and where these numbers here fail. Because these numbers are not putting the thing that we're actually comparing next to each other. It's adding an extra step in there, which is the math. And then you can compare the things that you need. So, in a different situation, I'm sure we've all been across a situation like this. You come into a game. I'll just turn the dialogue box for a second. So you come into a game with something like that. You get into a situation. This dude says you need to spend some money or make a purchase or something in order to proceed. You get into that dialogue and it looks like this. You might think here, oh, well, you're just making a purchase. Are you going to spend 5,000 gold to go into the castle? But you're not. It's the same thing that we had before. It's a comparison between this amount of gold and how much gold you have and whether or not that is valuable based on those two options, right? So here, by doing it like this, saying, would you like to bribe the guard? Here's for 5,000 gold. You're leaving out one of the key things that the player needs in order to make that decision. And so whenever you're asking like the player to make a purchase or do a comparison or whatever, you should always have what they're comparing against, right? So it should have something like this, the wallet. How much is in your wallet? And then if you wanted to be, this is another step on top of that, but if you wanted to, you could somehow do that math again for them. So it would be the same thing as Borderlands. You're not actually comparing the two numbers against each other. You're comparing the difference. So 5,000 would leave the player with 45,000. You would do the math and say, okay, this is how much you have, this is how much you're losing from it, and this is what you'll be left over with. What does a good UI look like? So to wrap this up, let's look at something that actually looks like a good UI. The Witcher 3. I've actually been really, really impressed with how good these Witcher dialogue boxes are. How is this different from our Borderlands thing? You actually have the numbers. This is what I currently have selected, right? And I'm comparing it to what I have equipped, which is the, not going to try and say that, Hindisfjall heavy armor. I guess I am going to try and say it. And this is its stats, right? So you can compare the stats by doing the math if you want to. Why would you do that when they're doing it for you, right? So each of these stats is being compared against the other stat, right? So if you were to equip this, right, you can look at each piece of armor individually, and all that you need is this. That's all that you need. Now, if you wanted to, you could compare this versus this. And the reason that you would have to do that is, so here you can see this is adding vitality. This doesn't have vitality. So the only other thing that you could do to improve this is you would probably say, you would list out on each side. So this might say vitality, and then it would say 0, which would be even, right? So like it's comparing against the things that are on the other one as well. So you have two lists of every single stat, and then you would only ever need to actually look at one side of this. And as you can probably see, you don't even actually look at these numbers. You never look at them, which kind of is what I was saying before about how those numbers are not important. You don't look at them. They're not important. What's important is the difference. You only ever look at these numbers, right? And you compare them against the things over here that are green. And so you can basically say, all green, this is better armor in every way except for these two stats. Is this extra stats worth losing those stats? Easy peasy. Easy peasy. Great piece of kit, right? And like I said before, you end up not even actually looking at the stats of the armor itself. You only look at the difference, right? It doesn't matter that this is 177 and 145. It's 32 better. Not once was I like, that's 40, but that's 20. So if 20 is bigger than 40, not once, right? You're only ever looking at the differences, which was my point from before. And so then the last thing I wanted to talk about was this, which is the crafting menu. And so even in the crafting menu, they're doing a lot of work to actually help you not have to do that math yourself, right? So you get in here, we're looking, we want to make this Superior Devil's Puffball. We've got these ingredients is what's required. You can easily see which ones we don't have. So we don't have these ones. They're red. They have a red number. They have obviously the amount as well. And we have all of these things, and the same thing. It says exactly how many we have out of how many we need, and it's color differentiated both in the number by green, that's the amount that we need, and the background. Red is the ones that we don't have. Let's draw focus to that, whereas the other ones have no background because it's fine. We have enough of what we need to be able to make this stuff. So same thing. This is a sword, but again, it's telling you if you were to make this blacksmith journeyman sword, you're going to have 79 less attack, but you're going to have better critical, you're going to have better stagger, you're going to have better dismember, but you're going to lose armor piercing. And this kind of UI is sort of what I was talking about before, right? So it's going to say plus 0 armor piercing, which is down 27, right? So now I don't even need to compare the two windows because I can see that the other sword that I have has armor piercing, but I'm going to lose it all because this has 0% armor piercing, right? So I can look at just this window, just this set of stats, and I can decide whether or not I want to make that sword. And again, it's all about getting back into the core loop. If we want to run around and kill monsters and do quests and solve mysteries as Geralt, the last thing that we want to be doing is math to work out whether or not this sword is better. And that's my talk. If you're watching this on YouTube later, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell,